This is part of what we intend to be a series of events hosted by Perry Worldhouse focused on the ongoing crisis. It's been 19 days since Hamas's devastating and horrific terrorist attacks on Israel shook the world. Since then, we know that Hamas has taken more than 200 Israelis hostage and has murdered more than 1,000 civilians. There's no disputing that these acts are deeply immoral war crimes, and in response to these heinous attacks, Israel has launched a legally sanctioned war against Hamas. Now, as we've seen the news unfold, we see that the war effort is made more complicated by Hamas's proclivity to hide amongst civilians and to use them as human shields against reprisals. If Hamas continues to put civilians in harm's way, how does that change the calculus for Israel and its response to Hamas's brutality? How can Israeli military and government ensure that its wartime response remains legal and ethical, and specifically that it's restricted to neutralizing Hamas and deterring future attacks against Israel and its citizens, but at the same time protecting as much as possible innocent civilians? These are tough questions and topics for all of us to be thinking about right now, given how much everyone is hurting over the repercussions of these attacks. And as the director of Perry Worldhouse, I believe that having these tough conversations and helping the PEN community understand the world as it is, not the way we might want it to be, is part of our mandate. We know that Israel needs to prevent harm to itself by neutralizing Hamas, but also that it needs to find a way to do that to put the world back on a path towards peace. So in order to really think about these topics in much more depth, I'm pleased to introduce two leading scholars on the issues surrounding laws of war and ethics of war, who can talk us through the international guidance around these topics. So our first guest is David Enoch, who's a professor of law and philosophy at Hebrew University and Oxford University. He's served as a clerk for Justice Benesh, the former president of the Supreme Court of Israel. After getting his PhD in philosophy at NYU, David has been a faculty member at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and now spends part of his time as professor of philosophy of law at Oxford University. And he's joining us today from the United Kingdom. And our second guest is our colleague here at Penn, Claire Finkelstein, the founder and faculty director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg Public Policy Center. She's also a distinguished research fellow at the Annenberg Public Policy Center and a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Claire is an expert in the law of armed conflict, military ethics, national security law, and professional ethics, and has published widely in national security and democratic governance. And Claire is also my colleague in philosophy, as well as here at the Carey School of Law at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. Thank you for being part of this really important and very difficult, but absolutely necessary conversation. To get things started, I want to actually make sure that we're beginning by just defining things appropriately. And I'm hoping that both of you can help us understand how you and how the international community more broadly uses some of the key terms that will be part of our discussion. So I'm going to start with you, Claire. I'd like to help us understand what are some of the central principles of international humanitarian law that apply to any armed conflict.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thanks for having me on this important program. First of all, it's important to understand that the principles of the law of armed conflict are very ancient. They go back at least to medieval times, if not earlier. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote extensively about these principles. And so when we see the modern incarnation of these principles in what is widely called international humanitarian law, or in the United States, we tend to call this the law of armed conflict, or LOAC. We should understand that these principles have been codified and encapsulated in, for example, treaties like the Geneva Conventions. The principles incorporated into these treaties go back much further and are really part of our international system of values. So there were two central principles that I think are worth mentioning given the limited time that we have, but they're really the two main principles that we would be struggling with in a case like this and in any armed conflict. And one is called the principle of distinction. And that is the principle that civilians are never to be targeted in war. And it's not as though if one side targets civilians, the other side can therefore target civilians. This is a categorical rule for all sides in a conflict, that civilians are never ever to be targeted. Now, that does not mean that civilians will not sometimes die in war. But when they do, it must be the case to be permissible under the law of armed conflict that it was not anybody's intention that they die, but that civilians die as collateral damage, the unintended side effect of the pursuit of a legitimate military target. Who is a legitimate military target? Well, in traditional international armed conflict, traditional military targets are men and women in uniforms, right? Soldiers, those who belong to a state apparatus. We don't need to talk here today about asymmetric warfare when you have non-state actors, because in effect we have state actors on both sides, though the status of Hamas in the Gaza Strip is a complicated one. Now, the other principle is the principle of proportionality. And that just means that in pursuit of a legitimate military target, the amount of collateral damage to civilians, whether it's harm to persons, civilian individuals, or civilian infrastructure like civilian homes, schools, mosques, etc., hospitals, that those must be collateral damage to civilian infrastructure and persons must be in proportion to the legitimate military aims. So to take out a minor military target, make a minor military advance, you cannot inflict massive civilian losses. So those two principles, the principle of distinction and the principle of proportionality, really define the boundaries around armed conflict and should guide every side in a conflict.
Thanks, Claire. And David, we're going to go, of course, into specifics, but I mean, you're both lawyers and you're both ethicists, so I'm going to ask you an ethics question, which is, Claire just described the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law as giving us boundaries. I assume that the ethical principles involved in war maybe take us a little further and help us make finer grained distinctions. Is that a way we can think about this?
Well, they certainly allow more by way of a critical edge. So given the state of positive international humanitarian law, we may still ask whether it's the laws that we should have. Now, that's a little tricky because the international humanitarian law is not as clearly defined or stipulated by sources, and the relations to what we think about the morality of war are very close. But it's still possible to make the case that in some respects, international humanitarian law, say, is too permissive for the use of force, and that maybe in other circumstances it's too restricted. So at the end of the day, when you ask legal questions, you have to at least partly pay attention to legal institutions and legal history and precedents and so on. And when you ask the moral question, you can ask them, as it were, from the start, and even use them to have some critical edge on the current legal arrangements.
Thanks. And so then maybe then beginning to get a little bit more specific, let me start with you, David, but I'd love to hear both of you comment on this. There's a lot of discussion around what it is that Israel is going to try to do or is doing and, will try to do in Gaza when it begins a ground invasion. And one question is punishment of Hamas, as opposed to neutralizing Hamas or neutralizing an adversary or deterrence, is that ever a legitimate aim of military intervention, punishment?
Right. I don't have a settled view on this. I have very strong suspicions on this, right? Partly because punishment, certainly if you understand it along retributionist lines, is at least a close cousin of revenge. And revenge, I think, is just never a justified aim at all. I'm not sure, perhaps there's more we can say about punishment in a way that saves it from this really unflattering relation to revenge. And so if we can, perhaps it's a legitimate aim. But what I think is really important, and I'm here going to rely on Claire's distinctions. One question is whether it's a legitimate aim. Another is whether, assuming it's a legitimate aim, it's the kind of aim that can justify collateral damage, can justify causing or tolerating harm to innocent civilians as a side effect. And that's something I do have a settled position on. So even if you think that punishment could be a relevant aim, I don't think it could ever justify by itself, ignoring other considerations, it could never justify any harm to any innocent person whatsoever. Of course, in realistic war conditions, if it can't justify any collateral damage, it can't justify any military action at all. And that is my view about the aim of punishment.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious what Claire thinks, but maybe I realized maybe before that, just to sort of distinguish, these three different things, what the difference between neutralizing an enemy or deterring additional attacks and punishing, and then kind of what these three different aims are, and then maybe what the law says about them. I don't know if Claire, you want to take that up, or if David, you want to.
Yes. Well, first of all, I need to disagree somewhat with David. Punishment is never a legitimate aim in armed conflict, and I can say this both legally and morally. Under Article 51 of the UN Charter, so to start with the legal side of it, the use of engagement in armed conflict is justified under conditions of self-defense. And the aim of self-defense is to repel the attacker and to secure oneself from imminent future attacks. And so while it may look like punishment, because of course, as was the case when the US was attacked on 9/11, the military action comes after the attack. So of course, one doesn't, except under rare conditions in which preemptive attacks are justified, and we could, in a fuller discussion, talk about that and talk about Israel and the Six-Day War, in which Israel did launch a preemptive attack on Egypt, anticipating an imminent attack from which it would not be able to defend itself if it waited. In general, self-defense is executed after an attack occurs. And that may make it look like punishment, but in fact, self-defensive action must not be punishment. If one knew for certain that the enemy was never going to attack again, that the enemy was neutralized, there would be no justification for attacking. There would be justification for conducting a war crimes trial. And then punishment could be inflicted. Punishment is something that one does under an authority of some sort. So whether it's within a state or it's punishment inflicted in an international context by an international tribunal, but punishment should be a function of a tribunal of justice, not a revenging military unit.
Okay, so we've talked about punishment and neutralizing. Maybe we can, you both briefly talked about deterrence, but maybe you could say something about how deterrence in this context in general.
Sorry, did you want me to?
Yeah,
sure.
could you start, and then maybe David can add.
Yeah. Well, so of course there is a linkage here which is confusing. So when a state imposes punishment, there are a lot of different theories of punishment. Is punishment retributive to inflict moral deserts on the offender, or is punishment deterrent in order to ensure that the offender or offenders like that individual never offend again? But in warfare, in fact, we don't have those aims. So certainly not retribution. Now, deterrence only in the sense of what we would call special deterrence. That is, we need to make sure that this offender or this attacker does not attack again. And Israel, under these circumstances, has no reason to believe that Hamas has been neutralized and that the danger that Hamas that manifested on October 7th won't reoccur. And so I think it is fully within Israel's rights of self-defense to engage in some kind of military action to protect itself from Hamas. And one doesn't even have to get into broader questions of general deterrence, but it does dovetail with punishment only in the sense that we're talking about special deterrence, which is that we are trying to repel and ensure that this attacker cannot attack us again.
Okay. David, did you want to add anything? And then it's time to turn to the more specifics, I think.
Yes, of course. So first, I agree. I agree with Claire, of course, about our point about punishment as a matter of law. What I expressed some doubt about is about the moral question there. But again, in practical terms, there is no difference between us, because once it's clear that punishment cannot justify collateral damage in a realistic setting of war, it means that it cannot justify any action at all. So at least practically, we agree there. About deterrence, I just want to perhaps make a point or two to help people see just how unbelievably complicated and cruel the game of deterrence is. So one thing that Claire hinted at, she focused on specific deterrence of the specific enemy of Hamas. But deterrence is about sending messages and creating incentives. And as long as other agents are watching, you are always playing that game as well. So for Israel now, there are clearly other agents watching. There is a, so far as it were, back burner kind of armed conflict, but it may change with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And there are other agents farther away, even more powerful, who are watching. So the need to deter them, that may be actually an existential need for Israel. So that's one point that has to be remembered. Because, for instance, some people say Hamas has proved that it is not a rational agent, it is not deterrable, so deterrence becomes an unjustified aim. But that is false, because you don't play the game of deterrence against a single agent. You play it against the field. And that makes things, of course, so much more complicated.
I do agree. If I can just jump in there, I do agree that you raise a very important complication here, which is, but I would put it by saying, is attacking Hamas in response to the October 7 attacks part of Israel's broader self-defense strategy?
Mm-hmm.
And that's I would put it in terms of self-defense, because that is the concept that grounds Israel's right to respond, not concepts relating to punishment.
No, I fully agree with that, of course. The second point is about how deterrence works. And the way that deterrence works, some people sometimes put it in terms of a kind of, your deterrence force is a multiplication of your military power and your willingness to actually manifest it in action. What it means is that if a country, no matter how powerful potentially, refuses for all sorts of reasons to actually use the weapons and the power that it has, this will in itself diminish its deterrence, perhaps to a non-existent point. And this is why the game of deterrence is so unbelievably cruel. You cannot afford, if deterrence plays a huge role in your self-defense and in the defense of your citizens, and countries, including Israel, have a duty to do that, then you cannot afford to be too hesitant with the way in which you use force. Now, none of this says that targeting civilians on the Gaza side is justified. It is, of course, not justified. We'll get, I'm sure, to some of it in what follows. But this has to be remembered. As long as deterrence plays a major role in the conception of defense here, then the game has to be unbelievably complicated and cruel.
Well, so you've raised, I think, in some sense, at least for me, and just listening to public discussion, the central issue, which is though, of course, it's clear that Israel may not target civilians. The way that Hamas conducts itself means that many civilians will become involved in this. Hamas is known to put its facilities in civilian facilities. It's known to shoot rockets from civilian areas. So, unlike in a conventional battlefield, there's just the civilians are very, very close to any kind of military action. So I actually want to begin with you, David. I mean, how does that complicate Israel's calculus? So we know that there is this concept of collateral damage, which is this kind of brutally named term, but civilians that are killed not by being targeted, but just in the course of conducting war. But I mean, how can Israel begin to think about this, given that it's Hamas that's putting civilians in harm's way? I assume that Israel must have to still be concerned about civilian life. It's not an excuse to say that it's Hamas that put the civilians in harm's way. So David, why don't you start?
The most important thing here for any agent, certainly any agent who uses deadly force, there is no evading responsibility. everyone is always responsible for their actions, although perhaps given the circumstances, this may affect things. But it's not as if you can transfer responsibility while dropping bombs to someone else. The question is whether, given the terrible circumstances in which you're in, your use of force can still be justified and you can, in good conscience, take responsibility for it. So I'm fully in agreement with that. I'm also in agreement with your claims about Hamas, but I want to take issue with something that you didn't say, but that may have been implied. I don't think that the only thing that explains collateral damage in Gaza are the tactics of Hamas, objectionable though they are undoubtedly. There are also some objective features like the sheer density of the population in the Gaza Strip. It's one of the most heavily densely populated areas on earth. There's also the question of the choice of weapons by Israel, and we can discuss this a little bit. And there's also the unbearable fact that in today's world, there is no such thing as military action without collateral damage. So really what explains the horrible things we see from Gaza now is the combination of all these factors. And Hamas can certainly in no way get off the hook, but the picture in this respect too is really complicated. Okay, so how does this affect the choice of means for Israel? So Claire already mentioned proportionality, and that's both the key term and the most frustrating one. It's the key term because the question is always, what are your legitimate operational aims here? Not how much harm you have already suffered. This is really important. Proportionality is always forward-looking. It's always about the future. You are trying to quantify, as it were, the significance of your military aim and the extent to which you are allowed to cause, as a side effect, collateral damage depends on how important that aim is, and also on some other conditions, like whether there are available alternative means that cause less harm, and so on. So the fact that so many people in Gaza are bound to die or be seriously injured from Israeli attacks, even if the Israeli attacks are in themselves justified, as I think in this case they are, that fact at the very least affects the kind of proportionality calculus. The more innocent lives are at stake, you should either not engage in this use of force at all, or you should show that the use of force is crucial for much greater goods on the other side, for much greater value in terms of collective self-defense. So this is why proportionality is so important. It's so frustrating because there's really very little we can do. And for people like us, even worse, very little we can theorize about how to actually measure proportionality. There are things we can say. The main two things I can say are against the extreme points of the continuum. So some people in Israel, this has to be painfully recognized. There are major voices in Israel that now call for pretty much annihilating the population in Gaza. This is, of course, beyond all proportion, cannot be justified in any ways. I hope that no decision makers are working with this in mind. I don't have evidence that they do, but it's certainly a voice that's being heard in Israel that cannot be defended morally or legally. On the other side, there are some people who are saying something like, there is no difference between intentionally murdering people, say, on the Israeli side, and the kind of collateral damage that Israel has been causing in Gaza. You are not supposed to kill innocents ever at war. And that is equally unjustified. It expresses a noble emotion, but it is nonetheless entirely unjustifiable. To say that will be tantamount in a real life scenario to saying that you are not justified in ever defending yourself. And that's a highly immoral claim. Where exactly in the middle between those two extremes we can, how to draw a proportionality line, I don't have a good answer for you, and I suspect that neither does anyone else.
Well, Claire, you're being teed up to give the answer, but no, seriously, how do you think about these issues?
No, David's exactly right. And the way that I would put it is to say that Israel does not lose its right of self-defense under the human shield scenario. So let me speak to that first, and then speak to the more general proportionality issue. If under circumstances in which the enemy is using human shields, right, which we know that Hamas does, Hezbollah does, or the circumstance in which They are in close proximity. They're sending rockets, say, from a civilian infrastructure, from inside a school or inside a hospital. Israel does not lose its right to self-defense because Hamas chooses to send rockets from close proximity to its own civilians. And that's a very important point. And it follows directly from general principles of self-defense that you know from everyday life, right? It's not specific to war. If you are attacked on the street and the only way you can defend yourself is to, pick up a bottle and throw it at your assailant, and the assailant is holding a child in its arms, you are entitled to throw that bottle to defend your life. And it is extremely unfortunate that the assailant is holding a child, but that is, as it were, on the assailant. We also have this doctrine, when the police respond to an attack, a call for an attack. If the police, and this is, I realize, wading into other controversial territory, but if the police engage in justifiable, and I don't mean unjustifiable or racist conduct, but justifiable defensive lethal force in order to defend someone, and they accidentally hit a bystander, the police are not guilty of murder under those circumstances, right? So this is the way that collateral damage works, and this is the way that self-defense works, and this is the way that other defense works, is that you don't lose your right of self-defense, or you don't lose the right of other defense because there are innocent civilians in the way of that defense. So here's the hard question, which is that in circumstances in which one side is using human shields, does it matter how many civilians are stacked up as part of that shield? And in other words, do proportionality calculations still take place when you are acting in self-defense? Are you obliged to assess how many civilians you're going to harm as you're fighting for your life? And the answer is yes, you are still obliged. But nobody knows exactly where the tipping point is. Is the calculation the same as ordinary collateral damage claims when there is not a human shield element? And I think the answer is probably no, right? Because the causality, the cause of that civilian being in danger is not you, the one who is self-defending. It is the other side who has put you in danger, right? So that, boiling that down to sort of simpler terms, Hamas puts the civilians that it uses as human shields in danger, and therefore, while you still are responsible for thinking about the level of civilian damage that you cause in exercising your right of self-defense, Israel doesn't lose its right to self-defense. Now, I want to return to a very important point that David made, which is human shields is not the only reason that there is this difficulty. Absolutely, Hamas engages in this strategy. Absolutely, they're endangering their own civilians by doing so. And I would like to mention here another point, that Israel has been very roundly attacked by calling for evacuation of North Gaza. I understand that as an attempt to minimize civilian harm. Whether or not you think it was a mistake to request or demand that evacuation, whether it was unrealistic to think that you can move 1 million civilians on short order from North Gaza to South Gaza when they have no place to go and Egypt is keeping the Rafah gate closed and there is no civilian exit through that gate, and Israel's gates are, of course, closed as well, is another question. But the intent was not genocidal. The attempt was to try to clear out northern Gaza as much as possible to minimize civilian harm, is my understanding. So I think that's an important point. There are reports, and there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation, so take everything that I say with the usual grain of salt. I'm only reading the same news reports that everybody else is. But There are reports of Hamas taking people's keys away so they can't flee in their cars and trying to keep civilians in place. That's the human shield element. But as David said, human shields is not the only issue. You have 2.5 roughly million people in 25-mile north to south at least strip, a teeny little area and no place to go. Now, I do think that we ought to be talking about Egypt's responsibility in keeping that Rafah gate closed and in not allowing humanitarian exit into the Sinai Peninsula and allowing, hopefully safe humanitarian exit, at least temporary encampments. But this is an extremely difficult situation. And how do you minimize, how do you engage in legitimate self-defense when you have dense urban warfare? That is a profound question under these circumstances.
I definitely want to return soon to the question of Egypt, and also David had mentioned some about weapons, which I want to return to. But before we do that, I did want to ask, both of you have alluded to, and I wanted to ask it straightforwardly. So Israel's been criticized, including most recently by the Secretary General at the Security Council on Tuesday, for halting humanitarian assistance into Gaza. In fact, Israel has even halted the entry of the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs into Israel. So blockading food, water, and fuel, is this lawful under international law? Is it ever lawful? Is it lawful now? What are Israel's duties regarding humanitarian assistance to Gaza? David, maybe we can start with you.
I'm going to defer to Claire on the question of international humanitarian law, though I suspect I know what the answer is and what she will say.
Sure.
I think we should distinguish. So when it comes to food and water, I just cannot see how this can be justified. There are much more limited things that may be. For instance, Claire mentioned the attempt to push, as it were, a lot of the civilian population south of the Gaza Wadi, I don't know, river, whatever. So, for instance, if we're talking about very localized, very temporary withdrawal of the supply of water just in order to incentivize people to go and so, but all of it, very, very restricted in time and place. Perhaps I can see a moral justification for it in really extreme situations, but that was not, at least officially, that was not Israel's policy. Israel's policy was much more aggressive than that. Certainly with regard to water, at least initially, I don't have any internal information. Based on the reports I've read, it was due to the American president's intervention that this was stopped. I can only hope that Israel never meant to prolong this, but I don't know. I can't see how, I don't see how this can be justified. But there are other cases of, let's say, borderline humanitarian things about which the case is, again, much more complicated. And the case I have in mind now is about oil. So oil is clearly of humanitarian value. You can't run a hospital without electricity. That's very clear. But on the other hand, oil is also needed for Hamas operations. And there are reports, I cannot judge their reliability, that Hamas has been taking some of the oil that was supposed to be dedicated to humanitarian causes in order to, I don't know, make sure that the ventilation systems for its tunnels still work. That means that oil has a dual character here. It's both a humanitarian good and a military means. And then I'm no longer sure what to say.
Thanks. Claire?
So let's distinguish between turning off supplies of water, food, gas, oil, and blockading them, because I think that's a very important distinction. When we talked prior to this forum, I gave you an example with Ukraine. So let me draw out that analogy for a minute. Nearly all of the gas lines from Russia to Western Europe flow through Ukraine. And we have had this nearly Kafkaesque scenario of the Ukrainian gas companies repairing gas lines that Russians had bombed in order to ensure that Russian gas could get to countries like Germany, right, which are big consumers of Russian oil and gas. While they're trying to reduce their dependence on Russian oil and gas, they remain fairly dependent on Russian oil and gas. And I wondered, with Russia earning about $1 billion a day from these sales of oil and gas to Western Europe, I wondered, why doesn't Ukraine just shut off these gas lines? Because they are literally funding the war against themselves. And the question is, would they have had the right to do that? No, obviously, Ukraine didn't want to do that because they wanted to keep the support of, NATO countries, Germany included, and they didn't want to, freeze Germans out in winter and so on. But I think they would have been entitled to do that. Is there an analogy here? Well, I think after 2005, when Gaza became at least legally, technically independent from Israel, Israel would have been entitled to say, I'm not supplying any more, gas. We're not supplying any more water. You have to build your own infrastructure. They were right to say, we're going to continue to supply these things for a transitional period. Those supplies went much longer than the anticipated transitional period, in part because Hamas took over and did not put the funding, energy, and attention into building infrastructure on Gaza that was needed for Gaza to be independent. So Israel continued to supply these things. Under the present circumstances, I think Israel was entitled to say, we're not going to continue those supplies because we view it as benefiting Hamas. We both want Hamas to not receive our supplies, and we don't want to make it easier for Hamas when they have the primary duty to care for their own population. But now a blockade is a different matter, because there is no entitlement to blockade human relief from other sources, from the ICRC, from other countries, from the United Nations, that are trying to give humanitarian assistance to Gazans. So I think that the blockade has been illegal under international law. I think it is very good that President Biden interceded, as far as we know, and Tony Blinken to lift the blockade. There was a small trickle of trucks coming in with humanitarian assistance now. It's a small drop in the bucket for what is needed. And the irony is that as the ground campaign, and there were reports overnight that the ground campaign is starting, that there's reconnaissance and early clearing of ground to begin the ground campaign. And the more violence there is, and the more the ground campaign begins in earnest now, the more humanitarian assistance is going to be needed. And so it's going to be a really excruciating situation. But I do not think that Israel can block it, nor should they.
Mm-hmm.
Can I quickly take issue with one of the things that Claire said? So Claire distinguishes between a blockade and merely stopping supplying oneself the relevant goods. And I think I accept this distinction in general. But I think that the situation in Israel and Gaza, and here the history of that situation, makes upholding this distinction harder a little bit. Because geographically, Israel, Gaza has this one Rafah gate to Egypt, but Israel has almost full control of anything that goes in and out of the Gaza Strip. And the reason, or a part of the explanation for why this is so, is the Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip and Israel's long-lasting policies about it, for which I think cannot be justified, and for which Israel is very much responsible. And I think that given that, for Israel to withhold water or electricity from Gaza is not exactly like the Ukraine stopping the passage of oil through its territory, but it is. I'm not sure it's exactly like a blockade, but it's closer to a blockade than the Ukraine case.
Mm-hmm.
I take your point on that.
Thanks for that clarification. And pretty soon we'll be turning to audience Q&A. So please, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A feature, and I'll get to them when I get to them. And I'll try to get as many as possible in. I may combine some of them. But Claire brought up the Rafah crossing and Egypt. So, Egypt has declined to allow Palestinian refugees into the Sinai Peninsula. There's some have called for some kind of a camp set up in North Sinai. Does Egypt what's Egypt's obligation, both if under international law and also morally if they diverge? Maybe David, you could start.
Again, I'm not an expert on international law. It's hard to say. The moral questions here are usually discussed under general questions of whether states have right, and if so, whether it's an absolute right to an immigration policy. And clearly, Egypt is terrified of the thought of many people, many Palestinians passing into its territory. But I think what I say now also is also echoed by international law. But even if you do, I'm not a great supporter of the rights of states to serious immigration policy and exclusion of people. But even if you are, you make exceptions for cases of immediate of refugees whose lives are in immediate danger. So yes, I would have liked to see the kind of willingness from Egypt that we're not seeing right now. Yes.
And legally, Claire, do they have an obligation?
Well, this is one of the difficulties of this sort of Westphalian state system that we have, and the concept of sovereignty, which is that no state has an obligation to open its borders to refugees from another state, and just as no state has an absolute duty to grant asylum to immigrants from another state, at least in international law. So I think this is a place where I would really want to distinguish a moral duty from a legal duty. I do believe that Egypt has a moral duty to open that crossing and to accept refugees. I very much appreciate the position that Egypt is in, both not wanting to be overrun by refugees and a fear of Hamas terrorists. I have no doubt. But I think there is a human and a humanitarian duty. I think other countries should assist in this, though. Why should the cost and the difficulty of managing such a large number of refugees fall solely on Egypt? So it should be an international a project, really, to get civilians out from Gaza, as many as possible, as safely as possible. And under the circumstances, even if Israel halted all action right now, the circumstances are so dire right now in Gaza, with hospitals running out of fuel and thousands of people killed and injured, that it makes a great deal of sense for the international community to assist with evacuation and temporary resettlement efforts, and to make it possible for Egypt to do that.
Thanks, Claire. So a lot of questions are coming in, so I'm gonna combine them in some ways just to try to get to as many thematics as possible. So a lot of people are interested in some of the questions we were talking about a bit before about the blockade and sort of the general condition of Gaza. So both of you had made reference to that as we try to understand what is that, what's the difference between offering assistance or a blockade, one has to understand it in relation to the actual relationship that Israel has had to Gaza since the withdrawal. So I wonder if maybe both of you could just say a little more about how we should understand that. So it's commonly said that, it's commonly said by some that although Israel withdrew, effectively Israel still occupies Gaza because it has complete control except for one border. So you, Claire, talked about one implication of that, which is the flow of goods. Are there others? And again, when in these really difficult conversations about proportionality, we talked a bit about how the conditions of Gaza and the actions of Hamas tilt things in one direction. Does the history of Israel's relationship to Gaza and the withdrawal, but still with the kind of complete control of the borders, shift anything in these proportionality calculations? So I wondered if you could both think through that with, I'm combining a bunch of questions, but on this topic. David, maybe you want to start?
Sure. I think this is actually one of the most complicated considerations here, and also one of the features in which the events of October 7th made a huge difference. So I think that Israel's occupation is in no way justifiable. And I think that Israel's blockade, I'm not talking about the past few weeks, but the blockade that's been going on, I think, since 2006 or something like this, is both idiotic and unjustifiable, morally or legally, as far as I know. And so in this respect, of course, Israel has a lot of responsibility for, bears a lot more responsibility for its past wrongs. The question which you raised was whether this affects in any way what Israel is allowed to do now as a response to the crimes against humanity from Hamas on October 7th and the future dangers, both from Hamas and from other agents in the area. For a while, I thought that a really qualified answer could be given. I'm even on the record saying in the past, when we thought the main threat was the occasional missile, then under some conditions, especially if Israel cannot fight this threat without causing tremendous collateral damage in Gaza, Israel should just be willing to tolerate that kind of damage, partly because of its own responsibility for the occupation. But what we've seen on October 7th is that the nature and severity of the threat is in a different order of magnitude. And this is now a threat that no state can tolerate, not even Israel. Even if Israel tomorrow fully recognizes all of its past and present wrongs having to do with the occupation, it still owes its citizens the kind of defense that it cannot give them without these heartbreaking and cruel uses of force. So I think that now, when we see what the enormity of the threat is, the history bears very little relevance to what Israel should morally do or is permitted to do now in defense. But it also has other implications. So, for instance, Israel, while using tremendous force to supply the kind of self-defense its citizens are entitled to, should also recognize the legitimate rights of Palestinians, should curtail horrible violence by settlers against Palestinians in the West Bank, should make it clear that it is committed to something resembling a two-state solution, and start to work in good conscience to do all of that. So I don't think that the past is irrelevant, but if we're looking very narrowly at what Israel is permitted to do now, given the current threats in self-defense, I think that it has very little significance.
Thanks, David. Claire?
The past helps to frame and explain so much of the sentiment and the reactions around the attacks of October 7th. But it doesn't help to justify them. I think this is extremely important. I'm profoundly disturbed to read the number of people writing about those attacks as though they were resistance, legitimate resistance. No attacks on civilians in war, intentional attacks on civilians, can ever constitute a legitimate military action on the part of any state or any non-state actors. And so insofar as Hamas was intentionally attacking civilians on October 7th, Israeli civilians, those actions cannot be thought of as justified acts of political resistance. And I really think that needs to be extremely clear, because we cannot have a discussion, we cannot have a serious discussion in which we are framing permissibility of action in war when we start from the premise that civilians are legitimate targets in war. And we must be able to distinguish between collateral damage and intentional targeting of civilians. And if it comes out that Israel is deliberately targeting civilians in its self-defensive actions in Gaza, I will say exactly the same thing. No side can target civilians. So the history should not be a basis for in any way impugning the accountability of Hamas for these attacks. Now, what I do think the history does tell us and help us to think through is the future of Gaza. And to understand that this was not a sustainable situation. I mean, I've heard Gaza referred to as an open-air prison. And I certainly understand that in large part to be the situation on the West Bank, and the Palestinian movement is not free on the West Bank, and the number of checkpoints that you have to go through, and the degree to which Palestinians live in sort of armed captivity around settlements on the West Bank, which is why I don't favor increasing settlements on the West Bank, because it only pits Palestinians and Israelis in greater conflict with one another in and that is a clearly occupied land. So I think the situation, I'm no Middle East expert, but this is a profoundly complicated situation. And what worries me most especially is that with Israel's aim to eradicate Hamas, which I personally think, given the attacks of October 7th, is a legitimate aim, because I don't think that Israel can live safely with Hamas in power in Gaza. There is no succession plan, right? There is no obvious next step for Gaza, and there is no safety there for Palestinian people, not that there is with Hamas, though. So I think it's absolutely critical to draw as sharp a distinction as possible between the Palestinian people and Hamas, and to continue in any way, anyone who sees the actions of Hamas as representative of the Palestinian people is really doing an enormous disservice to the rights and lives of Palestinians on the West, in Gaza.
Thanks, Claire. This might be a simpler, shorter question, but is there a distinction in international law between a terrorist, a terrorist or paramilitary groups and an army? Does anything that we've said so far change because?
Yes, I mean, let's distinguish first of all between non-state actors like, Al-Qaeda, that was responsible for the attacks on 9/11 in this country, and Hamas, which is the reigning power in Gaza. This makes the conflict between Hamas and Israel an international armed conflict, in effect. Even, whatever control one ascribes to Israel in controlling the movements of Palestinians seeking to leave Gaza, it's still the case that Gaza is Palestinian self-rule, and that Hamas is the ruling power. So therefore, it is a very different situation. It's not a NIAC, as we would say, non-international armed conflict. It is an international armed conflict. And that changes how you assess that. It is therefore what we would call state-sponsored terrorism, as opposed to terrorism simpliciter. And that is the name of the game these days. And of course, what the relationship is between Iran and Hamas, and that all remains to be revealed in the future weeks and months to come.
Thanks, David. We have a question that let's say hypothetically that Israel is able to neutralize Hamas and preserve a lot of preserve as much infrastructure as possible, preserve as many lives as possible, and the day after comes. I know that there's a lot of discussion around what's the plan, but actually this question is, what's Israel's obligation? How much are they obliged to try to fix things that got broken in the course of neutralizing Hamas? I think this is a moral obligation question. Like what obligation is Israel going to, because they unilateral withdraw, they created some of the situation we're in today. And so if they go in and do what they say they're going to do,
yes,
what must they do?
I'm not sure what the answer is. I think that given Israel's occupation since 1967, I mean, it certainly had all of the responsibilities of a ruling power until the 2004, 2005. It's also very clear that it has maintained at least some of these responsibilities since, because, I mean, as you said, it kept full control of the borders, but not just of the borders. It had full control of many other things. And after a couple of years, also of pretty much all goods. I mean, there were lists at some point of how many calories, according to Israeli blockade policy, each citizen in Gaza should be able to get, and so on. So when you have that kind of control over a country, you can't just pretend that that other country or piece of land or whatever is entirely independent. You can't just excuse yourself of all of the responsibilities that you had as the military sovereign of the territory. I don't know what to say about what will happen now, partly because it's so entirely unclear what the day after the war will look like in Gaza. I find it extremely hard to imagine any scenario, and certainly any good scenario. So I'm not sure what to say. I think that the hope is that there is going to be tremendous international help. It's going to have to be of a somewhat different character from what we've seen in the past. Obviously, that hasn't worked. And I tend to say that within that general international effort to make things bearable in Gaza, Israel too will have some responsibilities. But I honestly don't know what to say.
Okay. Well, we are coming very close to the end. So I wanted to ask both of you, I mean, these are incredibly complex issues, and I know we've only scratched the surface, although I appreciate some of the clarity that we've been bringing to this. But I'd like to ask both of you, because all of us need to think about these things some more, what would you like our audience to walk away to think more about? What should we be thinking as we watch the news? Claire, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm desperately hoping that we can lower the temperature, at least in this country, around these issues. And I think that international law gives us one way to do that. I really think that the framework that international law supplies, that international humanitarian law or LOAC, and there may be some distinctions between the two of them, but in broad outlines, those principles that are articulated under the UN Charter, the rules on self-defense, the rules on protection of civilian populations, the principle of distinction, which is such an important principle here. People need to understand these principles because they really do give us a way of making order out of the chaos. And it's very important to understand, and the US should understand this, we made profound mistakes in the wake of 9/11. We reacted in ways that made our country weaker. The whole idea that we were taking the gloves off by waterboarding people and rounding up massive numbers of detainees that knew nothing about the situation and putting them in black sites, that has not made America stronger. That's made America weaker. So when we ignore the laws of war, we do so at our peril. We don't enhance our own security. We don't make ourselves better able to fight our enemies. We make ourselves less able to fight our enemies. So I think the international community needs to rally around Israel, as President Biden has done in the wake of these attacks, but at the same time, and I think Biden has been excellent on this, to emphasize that Israel's response needs to be lawful. It needs to occur within the boundaries set by international law, and that those who feel so angry about attacks in Gaza need to at least slow down enough to understand what the principles are that have operated in international law since time immemorial in order to understand when conduct is lawful and when it's not.
Thanks, Claire. And David?
I would urge people to distinguish between the amount of confidence they have in decision makers and the complexity of the issues themselves. So, for instance, I have zero confidence in Prime Minister Netanyahu. I don't think he's in good conscience. I don't trust his judgment or his moral judgment. But there are some other people whose judgment I trust a little bit more, but I'm not happy with that either. But just noting that does not yet settle the questions of what should be done. right? And so I would urge people to try to think about that as well. What if there is a decision maker who is in good conscience, and they are trying to make decisions here that are both smart, rational, morally and legally defensible? And then I think when you ask these questions, it becomes clear just how unbearably complicated the issue is, and how also the kind of ready-made answers that some of us like to use won't help. So you can talk about colonialism until the cows come home. You also have to decide how you prevent civilian families from being slaughtered in their homes. You are not a serious decision maker if you don't also answer to that concern. And you can talk about the many mistakes, including many moral mistakes that Israel has undoubtedly been blameworthy of over the years. But you also have to say something about what Israel should do now. And it's not clear how exactly to fill in the details there. So all of these criticisms, and you can talk about how a general policy of peacemaking and perhaps also economic development can be more helpful over the long run, as I think someone suggested on the Q&A, which is probably true. I don't know if it's necessarily true. It's probably true. But you must also say something about what has to be now and what has to be done now for Israel to maintain some deterrence and to protect its citizens. And I'm not saying that Israel is acting completely justly. I would be shocked if it did. It's hard and also heartbreaking. But I think that appreciation of the full complexity here makes some of these ready-made slogans entirely irrelevant.
Well, David and Claire, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon, and for you, David, the evening. This is a very hard but very important conversation, and I'm really glad that we're having it here. For the audience, this is, again, the second part of a longer series that we're going to be doing, really trying to look at these issues that are incredibly complex, but with the kind of seriousness with which David and Claire brought to us today. So thank you all. Thank you again, Claire and David. Thank you to the audience. This will be, the recording of this will be online on our YouTube channel, and hopefully all of the participants will tune into future events. So thank you again, everybody.